Hello, everybody. Welcome into DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. My name's Brandon Adams. It's good to have you with us. We'll get Mike Griffith here coming up in just a moment. A lot to get into with Mike today. Some of it fun, some of it interesting on the basis of where we might be heading in terms of what football will look like if and when it does return this fall. We'll do a lot of that with him here coming up in just a moment. It's all made possible today by our friends at Merriweather and Tharp. They're your source for Georgia divorce. And unfortunately, divorce is a fact of life. Many of you are dealing with that right now, or you feel like you might be on the verge of dealing with that. And obviously, I'm sure for you, it could be a scary situation. One of the things I can advise you to do to make it less scary, to give you more peace of mind that eventually you can be made whole again, put back together again, both in terms of your relationship with your children and family, your finances, everything else, is to have a strong advocate on your side. And in this case, the strength of the advocacy comes from the experience having been through cases like this before. That's what my friends at Merriweather and Tharp provide. I truly call them friends because I've seen the work that they do, and I know their partnership with DawgNation and good people who are dedicated and devoted to solving problems for people who find themselves in the throes of a divorce. So they are your source for Georgia divorce. The best decision you can make in this process is to have them as an advocate on your side. So please reach out and find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. That'll get you in touch with Merriweather and Tharp. Before I bring in Mike Griffith on today's show, let me give you a little thought exercise. We'll take some more comments on this on video coming up in a moment. So obviously, as someone who has proclaimed himself to be the chief Gator hater with Eddie, the unofficial mascot of our program, I have very much enjoyed the last 3 wins for Georgia over Florida, dating back the last 3 seasons. However, if it comes to pass that Georgia beats Florida again, and I think that is what's going to happen, but if it comes to pass that Georgia beats Florida again, I believe that this year's win in the cocktail party could be the best yet for Kirby Smart for a specific reason. It is an unfortunate fact of life that many college football fans enjoy the misery of their rival more so than they enjoy their own success. I don't know why that's true. There's a nature of which that's just sort of human nature. It's more fun to watch a team you hate suffer than it is sometimes to sort of live through your own success. Well, you want to talk about Florida having some suffering, some pain going on. This is obviously supposed to be their year, but it's supposed to be their year in one specific area. And a lot of the preseason write-ups you're seeing show you evidence of this, that Florida found its quarterback last season in Kyle Trask. Dan Mullen, I'll play some audio for you on this in the podcast edition of our show, DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp later on today. Dan Mullen's supposed to be the play-calling genius. Play-calling genius paired with quarterback he can trust, that's supposed to be offensive magic. What if Georgia reimagines itself from an offensive standpoint? What if Todd Monken comes in and has the impact that Georgia fans hope that he can have? What if Jamie Newman, the transfer from Wake Forest, ends up, as some of the draft pundits are saying, actually better than Trask this upcoming season? Doesn't that completely deflate and, frankly, defeat the narrative that Florida fans have been trying to build that, yeah, Georgia may recruit better, but Mullen's a better coach, especially in the offensive side of the ball, and eventually that'll be proven out, and eventually Florida will win a game in this series because of that? Well, if Kirby Smart plucks a quarterback from Wake Forest, pairs him with a new offensive coordinator, and goes out and has a better offense than the Gators this season, and if Newman in particular outplays Trask for the entirety of the year and in the cocktail party on Halloween afternoon, at that point in time, there's not a whole lot the Gators could say anymore. I'll talk to you more about this in our comment section later on today here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, but just kind of a fun thought exercise for those of you who like hating on the Gators as much as I do. With that said, I'll bring in Mike Griffith on this topic here for a moment here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And Mike, do you understand where I'm coming from on this when it comes to Jamie Newman? Obviously, the jury is still out on how good he can be at Georgia. Certainly, there's some raw materials here that you can imagine UGA could use. But the one thing that some folks in the media, certainly plenty of Gators fans, have said is that eventually Mullen's coaching acumen, his brilliance on the offensive side of the ball, as they would describe, is going to be the thing that gives him the leg up against Kirby Smart. Well, this year, with him being one of the few programs in the SEC that brings back starting quarterback, at least of the top contenders, and for all the warm, rosy things that have been said about Trask, if Georgia rebuilds its offense around Jamie Newman, if Newman outperforms Trask, at that point in time, one of the key talking points for the Gators would seem to be greatly diminished at that point. Am I overstating things?
No, I don't think so. And I think the thing that they need to keep in mind is that, whether or not Kyle Trask is a future NFL player or first rounder, we saw last year with Jake Fromm, so much has to do with the supporting cast. What kind of offensive line does he have? What type of running game? I mean, he lost to Michael P. Ryan. I believe he's got to replace some receivers. There's more to it than just the X's and the O's and the quarterback. And I think Georgia was a case in point for that last year.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And, listen, when it comes to Florida, obviously, this is not a team that ran the football very well at all last season. And if you're going to compete in the SEC, that's something eventually you're going to have to do. And by the way, when you look at Mullen teams that have been successful, both as an offensive coordinator at Florida, as a head coach at Mississippi State, especially in 2014, the ability to run the football was something those teams put together. But last season, Dan Mullen almost defiantly anti-run, especially in the game against Georgia. He took some media heat for that at the end of the game. Hard for me to imagine, whether it's Kyle Trask or anybody else, Florida's building much in the way of a successful offense if they don't run the football better than they did a year ago. They do bring in Lorenzo Lingard, former 5-star transfer, but that's still a running game that's very much, I think, open for debate at the moment.
Yeah, I think balance is the key. I think you got to be able to take advantage of what your opponents don't do well, and conversely, try and stay away from it. I mean, Georgia, for example, had a much different game plan against LSU than they did against Kentucky. And obviously elements had something to do with that. But I think that's where it gets back to the balance. And Florida, to me, when I look at their personnel, they're not there yet, and that's the biggest deal of them all. Do I think Dan Mullen is a good coach? Yes, I think he's a good coach. But like any other good coach, he has to have great players. And then beyond being a good coach and having great players, you've got to have a great staff, and you've got to have it takes a lot, BA. We've seen it. I mean, you can have everything lined and still have something fluky happen that prevents you from winning championships.
I want to talk in a moment about a piece you've got coming up today at DawgNation.com that may, for all I know, already be published. Before I get to that, though, Mike, I believe there is a storm brewing with UGA fans that's probably not going to get as much media attention as it probably should. Now, there's a very serious issue going on of what does football look like when it returns this fall. I believe in some form or fashion football is coming back, and how safe are people going to be? That's a serious topic for people more serious than me to deliberate. But let's assume for a moment, I know Ray Tanner, the South Carolina athletic director, has talked about this. There have been some other things written about. Athens Banner Herald had some quotes from Greg McGarity about social distancing in college football. And there was a report in the Lexington, Kentucky paper the other day that, you're talking about a stadium like Georgia potentially only able to house about 20,000 people if you're going to have 6 feet in between, everybody in the stadium. Mike, if that's the case, if Georgia's trying to play games and there's a small number of fans, something in the neighborhood of, as has been kicked around, maybe it's only 15, 20,000, something like that, the debate over who gets to be that number, whatever the actual number ends up being, far fewer than the 93,000 capacity, the debate over who gets to be that number, assuming that's how all this plays out, is going to be quite contentious. Below the surface, the media doesn't cover this very much because it doesn't impact them, but below the surface, the battle amongst Georgia ticket holders, donors, about who gets priority seating is already a very hot topic. You cut the number of available seats almost, 1/5 almost of the available seats. All of a sudden, at that point in time, I think it becomes even more intense than it already is. If this is the way this plays out, Mike, that is a storm brewing amongst UGA donors, UGA fans. And frankly, I am very glad that I don't have to be the one that has to solve that problem.
Yeah, it's going to be a battle everywhere. It's no different than the battle for bowl tickets or, the battle. I'm sure there's only so many Georgia fans that can go to the Georgia-Florida game because that's not, it's never in your home stadium, so you don't have 90,000 people there. But it's pretty simple. I mean, you're going to have your major donors there. I think the people with the skyboxes will have a different set of rules than the general admission, as we've seen with alcohol sales in the past. I don't expect that to change. That's more considered a private entity versus a public location. So I think the skybox people are taken care of. Then I think you've still got to allot tickets to the student section because, after all, that is what college is all about. That is part of it. So I think that the students will still get their tickets. And then it just goes, it would seem to me, it just goes in order of the donations, just like it would bowl tickets. So I don't think there's much controversy there at all. You got to pay to play, and those that are willing to pay the most are going to get the tickets because the revenue the revenue model is severely challenged right now. Beyond, after the skyboxes and after the students, the student allotment, I think it'll absolutely be based on donations and donor level.
Well, keep in mind this, though. There's a huge number of student tickets already allotted. So if you only choose students, then essentially you filled the stadium with students alone. So at that point in time, if you start bringing in a lot of students, you're not making room for very many donors, which then sets up that sort of age-old battle that seems to go on in Georgia versus the people who have donated the longest compared to the people who've given the most. That always seems to be the sort of internal civil war amongst those tickets. And it is a hot topic amongst fans. I can promise you that.
Yeah, and I get it. There is a lot of unease right now. Nobody's moving forward with a business as normal. As we talk about the new normal, as we talk about safe, we hear people, oh, is it going to be safe to be in the stadium? I don't know. Is it going to be safe to be at the mall? Is it going to be safe to be at the gas station? Is it going to be safe to be at the supermarket? I mean, that's the thing we always miss in this equation when everyone keeps talking about we've got to make campus safe. I say, well, their community's not safe. I mean, I get groceries delivered at home. I mean, I could potentially get the coronavirus off a plastic bag as I could walking in the aisle. So the whole concept of safe and perfect solutions, we all have to be tolerant and understand that there's going to be some uncomfortable decisions and things outside the norm waiting for us between now and the new normal.
Yeah. Ultimately, I'm just glad I'm not the one that has to make those decisions because, frankly, determining what is safe enough for people is certainly a tough choice right now. I'm glad that's not me that has to make that decision. A topic that I'm a lot more comfortable talking about as opposed to, what football is going to look like when it returns is, assuming we have games, what the team itself will look like on the field. I know you've got a piece coming up at DawgNation.com today. It may already be published for all I know, where you look at Mel Kiper, his early big board for the 2021 draft, the seeming absence of Georgia players at the top end of this list in comparison to a program like Alabama that after having, a bunch of, very high draft picks this past season is in line for more of those this upcoming season. This to me is very similar to what I addressed with you last week, that if Georgia is going to win a national championship this season, then based on the recent results in the college football playoff era, the odds are that some top-end draft talent has to emerge. And for the moment, I don't mean first-round picks. I just mean first couple of day picks, players taken within the first 3 rounds. I told you last week that I believe that right now, on paper, Georgia has likely 4 players to be drafted in the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft. But if you use LSU as your guide from a season ago, you probably need about 5 or 6 more of those to really be the best team in the country. And I think the Mel Kiper big board only reinforces what I told you last week, that there are some names not currently listed amongst the best at their positions on the Georgia roster that will have to emerge as so over the course of the season for Georgia to truly be a national championship team.
Oh, no question about it. Right now, the only players that are listed at the top 5 of their position by Mel Kiper Jr. are Monty Rice and Jamie Newman. I was surprised that Richard LeCounte wasn't among the top 5 safeties. I was surprised not to see Tyson Campbell or Eric Stokes among the top 5 cornerbacks. I was surprised not to see Jordan Davis or Malik Herring among the top 5 defensive linemen, or Azeez Ojulari among the top 5 outside linebackers. Now, it's early. It's Mel Kiper's very first big board. I don't know how thoroughly or how deep he went into this, but the fact that there's 14 Alabama players listed among the top 5 at their position in the country and only 2 from Georgia, that's something that should be alarming, especially when you consider how well Georgia's recruited. And that's something that a lot of the Georgia rivals are pointing to if Kirby can't get a lot more guys drafted than he did last year off of his defense.
Well, what this brings to mind for me, and I'm doing more on this on our podcast edition of our show today, there was a recent tweet from Steve Sarkisian, the Alabama offensive coordinator, referencing a report from 24/7 Sports looking at how 5 stars have been developed in recent years. And according to 24/7 Sports, and Sarkisian tweeted this, about half the 5 stars that Alabama has brought in have ended up drafted in the first round during the Nick Saban era. That's far higher than the other programs in college football, and in fact, in some cases, almost double the college football average over the course of that time. Mathematically, those numbers don't quite mean, I think, what Sarkisian seems to think they mean. But it is an interesting point. When you look at draft-eligible former 5 stars for Georgia this year, it's names that we spoke about last week. It's Zamir White. It's Jamari Salyer. It's Tyson Campbell. It's Adam Anderson. When you look at guys who will be sophomores on this team this year that have a chance to, be developed for the following NFL draft, it's Nolan Smith. It's Nakobe Dean. It's Trayvon Walker. It's George Pickens. It's also Clay Webb, who we haven't seen as much of as of yet. But I do think it's fair to say to Georgia, to Kirby Smart, that if you want to fully form your coaching persona and if you want to put yourself in the best chance to win a national championship, then some of those names that I just mentioned, especially the guys for this year's draft-eligible class, Samir, Jamari, Campbell, Anderson, from that group, a couple likely first-rounders have to emerge. And if you don't have that happen, then it will be fodder for negative recruiting. But more importantly, it'll be another year in which Georgia may have to settle for being second best in the SEC.
Yeah, it's kind of a slippery slope there, BA, because we talk about all these 5-stars that have to be picked. But then on the other hand, we want to give Kirby credit for developing a 4-star and Andrew Thomas and a 3-star and Solomon Kinley and getting them picked. So it's not like you can just say, well, the 5-stars have to make it. Sometimes the 3-stars come in and win those jobs. Eric Stokes is a good example of that, a guy who wasn't highly recruited or highly ranked, I should say. So I don't get as much into that. I do understand why Alabama would float that. It looks good. If you're a 5-star, you go, oh, my goodness, if I go to Alabama, I've got a better chance of being drafted. And really, for a lot of these kids, that's what it comes down to is where do I have a chance to go to college that can get me paid and get me to the next level. Now, the name, image, likeness thing, BA, this is kind of interesting because this is going to get you paid a little bit sooner. And when you take a look at fan followings, you may get on the field sooner somewhere else. You may be able to talk as a freshman somewhere else. This equation is going to change beyond just where can I get to the NFL. There's going to be other factors. They're not just going to look at the stadium size or whether there's a waterfall in the locker room or whether there's a slide in the new football building. They're going to look at where their agent tells them they're going to get the most exposure and have the chance to earn the most revenue while they're still a player after fall of 2021.
Yeah, that's so far into the future for me. I can't quite process all that yet, but I do want to talk to you more about the draft part of this here in a moment. A couple more minutes with Mike Griffith. First of all, let me tell you about a great thing going on at Marlowe's Tavern. As we head towards Mother's Day, Marlowe's really working hard to make make Mother's Day special with some great to-go order options for either brunch or dinner. Now, if you order by 5 p.m. today, then you can either pick it up on Saturday or Sunday. You got great brunch options, great dinner options. The brunch includes, I love this, and this sounds so good, so much fun. If you're trying to make Mother's Day special for the mother in your life, how about some French toast casserole on the brunch menu? Or the dinner menu also includes braised short ribs. Really, really good stuff. Get your order in today by 5 p.m. Get ready to pick that up on either Saturday or Sunday and make Mother's Day special with to-go order options from our friends at Marlowe's Tavern. Marlowe'sTavern.com is the website to go to. Get that order in by 5 p.m. today, and then you can be ready to go with some great brunch and dinner to-go options as you get ready to celebrate Mother's Day this Sunday. And, folks, don't forget that. It's a little D&D PSA. Do not forget to take care of your mother on Mother's Day. Social distancing doesn't absolve you from that responsibility. Make sure you take care of that coming up here this weekend at Marlowe's Tavern. Certainly a great option to be able to do that. Marlowe'sTavern.com for more details on that. So go back to the topic of the draft here for a moment. Mike, you're right about the 3 stars that Smart has developed. I wrote about this at DawgNation.com that at times we pay so much attention to the top-end recruits that the way in which DeAndre Baker came through the program, sometimes that might get overlooked a little bit. Stokes has a chance to be another one of those guys in future years. Kinley was one of those guys this year. Kinley was a 4th-round pick, though, and I think that national championship teams are determined by how many first 3-round picks they put together, as I said before. The Clemsons, the Alabamas, the LSUs, recent college football playoff champions have proven that. And so when I look at the story of the upcoming season for Georgia, I am looking at, well, who really blossoms and goes from being a good player to indisputably one of the top players in the country. Not only is that good for Georgia's overall program profile, I think it determines how likely Georgia is to win a game on the road in a place like Tuscaloosa or be a factor into a college football playoff conversation. Great teams are made up by a collection of top-end player performances, and I'm looking to see, can Georgia add a few more to the list of known commodities on that from where we sort of start the season right now?
Yeah, Gene Stallings used to say, BA, that you could look at any of the close games and it's usually decided by 4 or 5 plays. And you look at those 4 or 5 plays and it's usually 2 or 3 players. Obviously, quarterback is a central figure in all of this. But I think on defense, Richard LeCounte is that guy. We saw Richard really emerge the second half of last year as a playmaker, involved in some very key turnovers and wins over Auburn, as well as the 2 interceptions against Baylor in the Sugar Bowl. Really liked what he made happen. Azeez Ojulari, I think we've talked about it on whether it was on your show or whether it was on our Cover 4. Can he finish a lot of these plays that were quarterback pressures and turn them into sacks? He was one of the difference makers that we discussed. And I think we also talked about guys like Zamir White and, obviously George Pickens. But I look to the receiving core, and And I say, who's number 2 and number 3? And I keep throwing Matt Landers out there. And I know he's dropped a lot of opportunities, but he also made a catch in the Sugar Bowl. And I think he's got some momentum behind him. He's a guy that had better play well to get on the field and be quickly passed by some of these incomers. So I think you're absolutely right. You got to have some key position players emerge, especially at wide receiver. You'd like to see one of those running backs emerge and be dynamic. I don't think you've got a DeAndre Swift, but hopefully you've got somebody that's got the game-breaking speed. And then defensively, I think we talked about it last week, disruptive plays, more turnovers and sacks. So to your point, those are made by special players. And right now, Mel Kiper doesn't have them on the big board. And to me, that was a bit alarming.
Well, it's okay, I think, not to be there in the preseason, but if we don't see names on that list, all SEC draft list on the postseason, then something has probably gone wrong for UGA this year. Mike, thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. We'll look forward to reading a bunch from you at DawgNation.com. And on this Thursday, we'll see you this afternoon at 3 p.m. for our Cover 4 broadcast, where you, me, DawgNation's Connor Riley, our recruiting insider Jeff Sintel, we'll get together and talk about all things UGA this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm certainly looking forward to doing that, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, B.A. Have a good one, man.
All right, good stuff there from Mike Griffith. So we can kind of get into both these topics on our comment section a little bit. I do want to talk more about the quarterback matchup potentially between Jamie Newman and Kyle Trask, and the chance for Georgia to really poke a hole in one of the narratives that's out there of, oh my gosh, Dan Mullen is just the greatest play caller in all of college football. I'd love to have a chance to do that with you, but I do want to kind of get more into what Mike is writing about in terms of who's not showing up on the Mel Kiper big board at the moment, and of those 5-star guys who have a chance to put themselves into a big conversation for Georgia. For the most part, we'll kind of focus on them, although as Mike alluded to with Azeez Ojulari, some of the highly rated 4-stars can also be discussed in something like this. But finding out those candidates to sort of increase the top-end performance on this Georgia roster, we can talk about a lot of that with you and pretty much what else you want to in the comment section here today. We'll roll through and get a bunch of these. I happen to be on YouTube right now, so that's where I'll begin. I'll go to Facebook after that. Noah Sheldon 500 says that Florida is nothing special. Georgia gets a chance to show that on Halloween, and I can't wait for that to come together. Real Boss says Kirby's defensive backs have been playing better, getting a lot of teams' defensive back core. They don't get a lot of interceptions, but they don't allow a lot of plays either. And I think that one of the things that Real Boss points out that I think you've got to pay attention to as an emerging narrative on this team is, can Georgia get its other position groups defensively to play as well as the secondary kind of has? I would say in the 4 years that Kirby Smart's been Georgia coach, a defensive back has been the best player on the defense in 3 of those 4 years. And as luck would have it, the 1 year in which that wasn't true was also the best individual performance for Georgia team in 2017 when Roquan Smith led the way. But it was Maurice Smith in 2016. It was DeAndre Baker in 2018. I believe it was J.R. Reed this past season. He was the AP All-American after all. The Georgia secondary is clearly a well-established group. Can the linebacking and defensive line core, can those groups join that defensive secondary in terms of being just as impactful? That, to me, is the difference in being simply good and a national championship contender compared to being a team that actually gets in the playoff and makes some noise once it gets there. You've got to have more action coming from your front seven. You've got to be more dynamic with tackles for loss. You've got to be sacking quarterbacks more. You've got to be doing more than just limiting yards and limiting points because, as you saw in December against LSU, if you're a stingy defense against an explosive offense over the course of time, the numbers just favor the explosive offense in that situation. Georgia's got to be as impactful defensively as the most explosive offenses that it faces, and that happens with your front seven more so than in your secondary. That, for me, is a huge story and a huge, huge point to pay attention to for this upcoming season. A couple more comments on YouTube, and then we will go to Facebook. Scott Harris says, are you worried about players getting out of shape during all of this? The teams that manage that best will be successful this year. I'm not worried about it because I know it's going to happen. I know for a fact. I'm not going to obviously project who it will be because I don't have that information. But of the 85 scholarship players at a place like Georgia or any school, but we're going to talk about Georgia at the moment, when they return to campus, some of them will be out of shape. They just will. It's just very hard to manage what's happening when it's out of sight, out of mind. What you focus on expands. What you measure improves. And when you are not able to pay attention to the players when they're off on their own. Some of them are not going to manage themselves as well as they could. There will be some players in the Georgia roster who show up out of shape. I don't think that's a reason for panicking. I think this season, like all seasons, but maybe more so than usual this year, will favor the teams that have the deepest roster. Because the same way that you have to turn to another player when an injury occurs, you may have to turn to another player this year because somebody else has just got a little too much weight. Or for the guys that have a hard time maintaining their weight, they may have just got a little too skinny. I mean, there's that going on too. There are some people who have a hard time maintaining that muscle mass necessary to play at that SEC weight. You may deal with that to a degree. Guys who've got a little too small, guys too heavy, guys too small, you'll probably have a little bit of both of that. By the end of the season, it's not going to be as much of an issue anymore. But at the beginning of the year, for every team, it's going to matter. So if you have a thin roster, and by thin, I mean number of players that you trust to put on the field, if you have a thin roster, it's going to be a huge problem for you. If you have a robust roster filled with talent, even if one of your trusted starters is a little out of shape, you can be okay moving someone else ahead of him. And all the more reason to do that. Reward the guys who've taken good care of themselves during this lockdown time. It's going to be a factor for everyone. I don't think it's a calamity, the kind of thing that should keep you from wanting to play the season, to make you nervous about it. You just have to find the 11 guys on either side of the ball who are the most in shape, most ready to go. But I have no doubt physical conditioning for the players who've lost some strength, for the players who've added some bad weight, physical conditioning is going to be a storyline for every team across the board. And it may not always be easy to see. In some cases, we may notice it. A guy's getting brought down from behind in a way that he would not have before. Other ways, it may only be the coaches themselves who really, truly see it for themselves. But it's going to probably be a storyline. I would say it's almost impossible for it not to be. Let me do one or two more on YouTube, then we'll go roll through some Facebook comments. Let's see what else is going on here. Jermaine Dunbar Trucking says, when will you let fans do a live call-in? That is certainly one of the things that when we get back into our studio, and I can't take calls right now because I'm in my kitchen, but when we get back to the studio, that is definitely a wrinkle to the show that I'd love to add in. I think it's a great question. Thanks for asking. Noah Sheldon 500, by the way, says Quay Walker or Adam Anderson will be the next Roquan Smith. So pretty bold prediction there about a couple of guys from that 2018 signing class who could really be ready to explode this year. Walker got to play a lot more last season, so he would certainly seem ready to do that. One of the real interesting guys that doesn't get mentioned there that I've always been kind of fascinated with from the 2018 class was Channing Tindall, who I thought had some moments as a freshman, sacked quarterback a couple times, for instance. I thought Tindall was on his way to being a very good player, and then we didn't hear as much from him last year. Part of it's because Nakobe Dean came in a year behind him, and you could not keep Dean off the field. But Tindall's one of those guys that I just love to be able to see more of, and I'm not quite yet ready to sell my Channing Tindall stock, if you know what I'm saying. All right, over here on Facebook for a moment, we'll get some more of your comments kind of coming in here. Robert Barnes mentioning the freshman that played last year. I'd say in this particular case, that's a positive for Kirby Smart. It's true that not only can Georgia sell that from a recruiting standpoint, hey, you come here, we'll play you, but when it comes to needing depth, hoping to have as much experience depth as possible in a year where you're just not really certain about what all your players have been doing during this coronavirus shutdown, having a longer list of players that you potentially trust to play, that really matters. I think that's quite true. I think it's quite true. Quite true. Bobby Powell checking in from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Bobby, thanks for being here. I really appreciate that. Daniel Holtz, by the way, on Facebook, also echoing the sentiment about Adam Anderson. That's one of those 5 stars that I mentioned a moment ago that Georgia has a chance to develop and have a big season in a draft-eligible year. Maybe in kind of a similar role to what you saw DeAndre Walker be in for Georgia in 2017 as kind of a designated pass rusher, a guy who gets a chance to really take advantage of what he brings to the table. Anderson, to me, has always kind of looked like an NBA player. He's tall. He's got very long arms. Can be a little, thin, but that doesn't mean he's lacking in muscle. He's just so tall that it makes his frame look a little more slender than some of the other players. But that incredible level of athleticism that goes along with that, to have that kind of interesting long frame and have the speed that Anderson possesses. Interesting to think how Georgia might be able to use him this season. If you're looking for a big breakthrough in terms of an upgraded pass rush, it's interesting that commenters on both Facebook and YouTube have mentioned Anderson as a prime candidate to do that. This is an interesting prediction from Mike Zambiazzi, who says that he thinks that Keely Ringo cracks a starting role on defense this year and earns at least third-string All-SEC. We definitely saw a freshman thrive at cornerback last season in the SEC, Derek Stingley. Typically, cornerback is one of those positions that you kind of rank a little lower on the list of impact freshmen. It's just hard to play as a freshman cornerback in the SEC. We've seen guys do it. Vernon Hargraves did it for Florida a few years ago. Stingley did it for LSU last year. Tyson Campbell, a little bit of an uneven experiment for him at Georgia in 2018. But obviously Ringo is just about as talented as anybody that Kirby Smart's recruited thus far through his first, 5 recruiting cycles at Georgia. He's about as talented as anybody as Kirby's brought in. But this is also a very deep secondary. So if Ringo emerges there, then you're saying something pretty spectacular about him as a talent at the moment. Let's see where we kind of come through on this. Jan Armistead says, we'll know who the most self-motivated players are when the season starts. And yes, self-motivation matters here. And this is one of those things where there's a lot that an SEC player goes through that we have no concept of whatsoever, right? What's it like to be that big, that strong? What's it like to, in some cases, absorb the information that we're asking a lot of these players to absorb on any given play? We kind of don't know what that feels like. But when it comes to this particular thing, I do think the average Joe like me has some concept of the challenge of being self-motivated. I mean, I'll be very honest with you. The coronavirus shutdown's been a little tough for me. I have wanted to eat a little bit more than I typically should, maybe want to drink a little bit more than I typically should. You just sort of get bored around here. Grocery bills kind of go up, which I'm sure the folks at Kroger love, but the fact of the matter is you're just sort of sitting around and you're just kind of wanting to just consume a little bit more than you typically would. That self-motivation to prevent that is sometimes it's not always easy to find that reservoir. It's also sometimes, I would say, a little more difficult to stay focused on work because when you're in the office or in the studio, that can be kind of its own natural reminder that this is a work thing, that you're in work mode. When you're at home, it can be easy to convince yourself you're in home mode, especially when you got things going on with family, which most of you do. Finding that degree of self-mastery, self-motivation, to be in charge of yourself is not easy for any of us. I think, anyway. I would certainly say that for me. And so for the players themselves, even though I could never lift the weights that they lift or do the conditioning work that they do or study the playbook maybe as diligently as they're asked to study it, I do know what it feels like not to want to do anything but just sort of sit around and, watch TV. I do sort of know that feeling, and I'm sure the players themselves, they're kind of dealing with that. Travis Hall mentions Nate McBride. Somebody else mentioned McBride a moment ago as well. McBride's another one of those guys that I have a sneaky suspicion will be eventually heard from at Georgia somehow. I mean, when you watch the path that Tay Crowder traveled to Georgia, I'm not saying that McBride will be as good as Crowder was, but Crowder was a guy that over the course of his career, people could have given up on, and he never gave up on it himself and was eventually rewarded for that. I had a chance to speak to McBride last spring. A lot of reporters did. He came out and spoke to us for a moment after a spring practice one day. And in speaking to Nate, and I'd never really spoken to him in a one-on-one setting before, but speaking to Nate, you kind of came away with the understanding of why he is popular. It was cool. Once again, I feel like I have some insight into how this must feel. He himself is like a top 100 player in the country of the class of 2017. I mean, he was an elite recruit, man. There's no doubt about that. He was a big-time player coming out of Vidalia. And yet, when you come to Georgia, and then in future classes, you got like the greatest, I don't want to exaggerate this, but I mean, about as good a collection of linebacking recruits over the class of 2018, 2019, even Sherman for 2020. I mean, it'd be hard to out-recruit Georgia what it's done with the linebackers over the course of the last 3 classes. And yet McBride was as proud of that as any fan was. You talk to any fan in our comment section on Facebook or YouTube, hey, how do you feel about Georgia's linebacker recruiting? The level of excitement that we've all shown about that, Nate was just as quick to show that as anybody was. Oh, man, I love all these linebackers. Great. He had best attitude about it you could ever have. So it's easy to understand why people root for him. I root for him myself. And when you hear him speak and the pride that he has and the depth of his linebacking core right now, it's kind of a cool thing. And as I said before, somehow, some way, I still feel like McBride's going to be heard from at some point in time before the Georgia career is done. So we'll see. Let me get a few more down here. Eric Emmett says having a brand new quarterback in the system isn't perfect in my book, but I still like our chances. Yeah, it's not perfect. I think, though, when you look around, there's really no situation in the SEC from a quarterback standpoint that you would say is probably perfect. Now, the closest to being established are, we mentioned Kyle Trask off the top of Florida. However, even the Florida situation for a moment, keep this in mind. Even at Florida, where they feel like they know who their starting quarterback is, they definitely want an expanded role for Emory Jones. They definitely want that. The absence of spring practice, the uncertain start time to the actual practices, the lack of connection to the campus environment right now has definitely made it more difficult for them to construct that role for Emory Jones. So even if Florida knows who its starting quarterback is, I think it's also been hurt by not having regular goings on, and with Florida having so much to replace the receiver position, trying to figure out if it's going to be able to run the football. They are harmed by that as well. Certain at quarterback, but uncertain in almost every other aspect of the offense. But they do at least have their starting quarterback, it would appear. Auburn's pretty well settled on Bo Nix, as well as it probably should be. Not necessarily a great quarterback as of yet, but a quarterback they feel pretty good about. So that's a team you may say, well, they're not probably as harmed by the absence of a spring practice and the absence of being away from the program. But at the same time, they're breaking in new running backs. They're trying to figure out what they have offensively. They've got a brand new offensive coordinator, much the same way that Georgia does. And they're trying to figure out the tug of war between Gus Malzahn, who does seem to want to relinquish control, and Chad Morris, someone who I believe has the credentials to justifiably take over when it comes to that Auburn offense. So they're not dealing with a perfect situation either. LSU's got a brand new quarterback and a new passing game coordinator to go along with that. That speaks for itself. Alabama's in the midst of a quarterback competition. Two names between the two of them. They probably feel decent about both of them, but that's not a perfect situation. They don't know where all of that's going yet. In the SEC West, you do have Kellen Mond at Texas A&M. That's just probably close to like a true solid lockdown, offensive quarterback situation you're going to find. But as luck would have it, much the same way I've said about some of the other SEC programs with established starters, there's no running game in place yet at Texas A&M. To say nothing of a program like Tennessee, which is trying to build momentum for how it finished last season. My gosh, the Tennessee quarterback situation is as uncertain as it has been at any point in time in recent years. Some Vols fans seemingly want to give Jared Garantano another chance. Other folks saying anybody but Garantano is the guy they want to lean on. So there's really an imperfection across the board in the SEC when it comes to those quarterback situations. And nationally, you probably see a lot of the same thing being true, but certainly in the SEC. Gerald Harmon says the Tennessee quarterback situation is going to be very interesting. It is, Gerald. And if you don't mind, let me give you a couple of numbers here for a moment. I've got this for the podcast today, but I'll give this to you on this for a moment, because here's what I was looking at for Tennessee. I have said it over and over again that I think that maintaining the on-field momentum for Tennessee this season is not going to be as easy as some people think. That matching last season's win total or adding to it is actually going to be pretty hard for Tennessee. As Gerald points out, quarterback a big reason why. Let me give you some numbers to back that up. ESPN's Football Power Index has recently been re-updated, projecting wins and losses for teams. The FPI for ESPN only projects Tennessee with 6.3 wins for this upcoming season. They're over-under, a number that you can bet, more or less wins. For DraftKings is at 7. For Caesars Palace, it's 7.5. So across the board here, you've seen a lot of projections for Tennessee in between 6 and 7.5 wins for this upcoming season. But how about this, to take this a step further for Tennessee on the field this year? FPI favors South Carolina against Tennessee, which is something that I've already told you about. FPI only makes Tennessee a 5-point favorite against Arkansas and makes the game against Kentucky around about a toss-up, giving Tennessee about a 51 or 52% chance of winning that game. And if you're curious, the ESPN Football Power Index gives Georgia more than a 90% chance of beating Tennessee when they play in November. So for all of the talk you've heard about Tennessee as of late, experts, math people, not exactly expecting that momentum to be maintained on the field. So just something to keep in mind there. We'll roll into our artist, Andrew School, down here. I'll remind you, air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. One of the things I like to do to sort of maintain a sense of normalcy right before the show comes on, I love to get in that shower, let that hot water just rush all over me. Sometimes you see the hair sort of wet and slick back. Not quite as slick back today. I guess I got out of the shower in enough time to give it a chance to dry. But we all like that hot shower. And if yours goes out, kind of stinks, right? You're in many cases quarantined, locked into your home, and you're kind of facing a situation where if your hot water goes out, that's even worse. Well, if yours does, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace that for you, oftentimes in the same day. But you've got to give Dari and the team a ring over there. Find them online at rsanders.com. All right, a couple more of your comments, then we will get ready to roll on after that on both Facebook and YouTube here for a moment. What else is going on? Brian Roche kind of an interesting comment. Let me see if I can get this full comment. He says, there have been many new quarterbacks that came in and did great things. 2 or 3 of the quarterbacks in the playoffs last year were first year at their school. Yeah, that's certainly been true. We've seen transfer quarterbacks, guys who are new to a program, have great success in the college football playoff era. I also think that last year, even though Joe Burrow was a transfer, he was a transfer from multi-years prior from Ohio State. I think that Burrow actually recast the quarterback narrative a bit. Burrow showed you last year that experience matters. Now, I think the experience coupled with what I think of as a top-flight, innovative offensive mind in Joe Brady, that certainly helped Joe Burrow. But Joe Burrow was a little bit of a counterexample to recent years where, Tua Tagovailoa had great success as a freshman. Trevor Lawrence, great success as a freshman. Jalen Hurts had very good success in 2016 in Alabama as a freshman. Even prior to that, Jameis Winston won the national championship as a redshirt freshman. Johnny Manziel won the Heisman Trophy as a redshirt freshman. You had seen just, a lot of really good success from these like first-year players in a program. New starters had been success. Returning starters had very little national championship success, prior to last season. You had not seen as much of that. Well, Burrow was a counterexample to that. When you think about Jamie Newman, who is brand new to Georgia, but not brand new to college football, trying to find whatever magic that seemed to come the way of Joe Burrow due to experience, kind of fun to think about. Kind of fun to think about for him. Let me go back over to YouTube for a moment. We'll get ready to wrap things up here today on this edition of DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Thar. Bank Sixes, I'm curious to see what happens to D'Angelo Gibbs over at Tennessee. Yeah, I haven't heard as much from Gibbs as of late. I know at one point in time he was, I guess, talking about a position switch, but to be honest with you, I'm not even sure that Gibbs is on the active roster. He may be. I haven't heard much about that. I think that Tristan West brings up a really good point. In terms of those 5 stars that George is looking to develop this season, I think that Tyson Campbell belongs on this list. I think, long time DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp listeners and viewers, know me to kind of be a little bit of a, what do the kids like to say, a stan. I'm a little bit of a Tyson Campbell stan. People kind of know that I've always touted for Campbell. And when he was removed from the starting lineup in 2018, that was, obviously, an eye-opening thing. Stokes came in and played really well, but kind of left you wondering where things were with Tyson Campbell. Tristan brings up a really good point in our YouTube comment section, though. Campbell, before getting hurt last year, was playing very well early in the season. Unfortunately for Georgia, and fortunately for those of us who are Georgia fans, we just didn't get to see much of that the rest of the way because Campbell was hurt. So, and he spent, I don't think he was even healthy at the end of last season. So there is a really good chance that a lot of Georgia fans who've allowed Campbell to grow out of sight, out of mind because of the fact that he wasn't in the field very much last season, they may be in for a very pleasant surprise, assuming Campbell's healthy and ready to go for this year, because this is a guy who may be ready to fully, blossom and shine. I know the knock on Campbell was he didn't spend as much time as a full-time cornerback in high school as maybe you'd like for your 5-star cornerback to have spent. But I think Campbell, what he showed me last year, is he's absolutely a cornerback. This is absolutely a guy that can play that position. Because of his speed, he's likely to get some attention from NFL scouts. But he has a chance to kind of put that season together for Georgia this season, which I think is a ton of fun. So let me get a couple more. James Wade says Tyson Campbell's looked the part of a 5-star. I think, James, the jury's still out on that. But as I said before, you go back to the beginning of the season last year, I would say that he looked like what you would expect a 5-star cornerback to look. Small sample size, a longer, body of work for the season. Would have told you more about that. But I am very happy with where Tyson Campbell is right now. Very happy. I think there's something to be gained by by the way, this is one of those things where, like, I didn't change my tune on this when Campbell was having some rough times in 2018. And gosh, it seemed like every single week some team was trying a trick play, halfback option passing along those lines. They were trying to fool him on a trick play, and it seems like he got fooled a couple times. But you can go back and find the tapes. The good thing about DawgNation Daily is every single one of these are archived on Facebook, YouTube, podcast, wherever else. I didn't take one step off my Tyson Campbell corner, even when he was struggling in 2018. I didn't change my mind at all. So I'm still very high on Campbell and always have been. Let's see a couple more. Anything else before we get ready to go? Noah Sheldon says he thinks that Bryce Young will start over Mac Jones, in my opinion. I think the progression of how this happens might matter. Prior to Jalen Hurts, we always saw Saban for really almost a decade choose the more experienced quarterback in every one of his quarterback battles. Once Jalen Hurts came along and then Tua Tagovailoa after that paradigm greatly shifted. But I think the question is, take two big games for Alabama. More likely quarterback versus Georgia, that might still be Mac Jones, much the same way Cooper Bateman, for instance, would have started, some games in 2015 or whatever else. More likely quarterback when Alabama plays Auburn, you may be right. That may be Bryce Young at that point in time. But for Georgia, I would put the point spread odds slightly favoring Mac Jones being the starter in that game. I would. I think that Bryce Young eventually winning that job, might make some sense. By the way, can I have a quick confession? After this, we have to go. So one of the things that I'm not great at are names. Football, you got a lot of names to remember, things like that. There's nothing I hate more than when names are similar. So Bryce Young's one of these guys coming into college football, and I always hesitate when I say his name. This is the five-star quarterback signing in Alabama, because when I'm thinking about Bryce Young, I start thinking about the former Ohio State pass rusher Chase Young. I get very confused about that. The reason why I get Bryce Young and Chase Young confused is because up until this past season, Clemson had a quarterback named Chase Bryce. So you got Chase Bryce, Chase Young, and Bryce Young. And trying to keep these three players separate has been such a problem for me. So I don't know what that means for my mental capacity, but I've had an issue doing that. James Wade says, so the LSU Alabama game isn't a big one. No, what I'm saying is that I'm just comparing the Georgia game and the Auburn game because they are like the farthest removed in the schedule. Georgia very early, Auburn very late. The LSU game, I would say, obviously, may, from an Alabama fan's standpoint, be bigger than the Auburn game right now. But I think it's more clear to say that Mac Jones probably starts the game against Georgia, and maybe more likely that by that point in time, Bryce Young has emerged as the starter for the end of the season game against Auburn, and likely by the time you play LSU there as well. Alabama plays LSU there as well. By the way, Bama Boy on YouTube checking in to say that Bryce never got the spring experience. He's behind the 8 ball, but Bryce will finish the season as Bama quarterback, which is about what I would have thought. That's about what I would have thought. Let me get one more and we got to go. Let me find a good one to end on. Ronald Rebels talking about Campbell balling out before this injury. I would agree with that. It's fun to see the Tyson Campbell talk today, which is, I think, kind of appropriate because, as I said before, if you're looking to see Georgia put more first-rounders into the NFL draft, the ranks of the 5 stars are the easiest place to look for that to happen. And between Zamir, Jamari, Campbell, Adam Anderson, could you turn 2 of those 4 into 5 stars? Is that asking too much? And before you say that seems like too much, remember, Isaiah Wynn, a player playing out of position for Georgia in 2017, he became a first-round pick. Georgia has had first-round running backs here within the last decade or so. Is it impossible to think that Zamir White, the nation's former number 1 running back, could emerge as that first-round guy? You wouldn't expect that from him right now. At least nationally, he wouldn't be thought of that way. But is it impossible to think that could happen? I think that Campbell is a very interesting name in this discussion because he has been mentioned as a potential first-rounder in a couple of the early mock drafts. And you've got a guy like Adam Anderson there as well, who may be in more of a specialized role and a part of a deep core of outside linebackers, making it harder for him to emerge in that spot. But could 2 of those 4 become 5 stars? That's pretty interesting to think about. Anthony Kurgel says, I look like Arn Anderson. Let me tell you something. That's about as nice a compliment as you can give me. That's about as good a compliment as you can give me. To compare me to the Enforcer, I'll take that any day of the week. Any day of the week. By the way, Stony Lit says, don't forget about Tyreek Stevenson in the secondary there as well. A lot of names to mention for sure. We'll see you this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern time for our Cover 4 Live. Me, Mike Griffith, Jeff Sindell, Connor Riley. We'll look forward to doing that. And our buddy Eddie, the unofficial mascot of DawgNation Daily, wants me to remind you it's now been 1,286 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. Boy, it doesn't get any better news than that. Does not get any better news than that. Make sure you check that out. Gator Hater Updater every single day here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Also, on the way out the door here, let me also remind you, make sure you check out the AJC for your Atlanta News Now. Stay up to date on everything going on. Certainly, NFL schedule comes out tonight. 3-hour release on the NFL Network. You can follow what the Falcons schedule is going to be, or whichever NFL team is your favorite. Lots of good coverage about that coming up at ajc.com. And if you're looking for more gift ideas for that mother in your life, your mother, your wife, whomever else, ajc.com has got you covered on that. By the way, speaking of those gift ideas too, one more reminder, check out marlowestavern.com to get your to-go order in today by 5 p.m. for brunch or dinner that you could be picked up on Saturday or Sunday. Some really, really delicious items on those brunch and dinner menus. As I said before, how about French toast casserole for the brunch, the braised short ribs, man, just good stuff. You can find out more on that at marlowestavern.com. Thanks to our friends at Merriweather and Tharp for bringing DawgNation Daily to us today. Y'all have a great day. I'll see you back here tomorrow at 10 a.m.